Hey guys, it's Miss A, and this is the third video in our unit on test-taking strategies. Before we get into our tip for today, let's take a second and quickly make sure that you're ready to go. You should have your EOG review packet, as well as the passage from marbles to machines in front of you. If you don't have those two things in front of you, go ahead and pause the video real quick and get them out and be ready to go. Once you have those things in front of you, let's take a second and review the things that we've talked about so far. In the last two videos, we've talked about two different tips that you might want to use in the text today. One thing we said was that oftentimes it can be helpful to chunk a large text into smaller pieces, to physically sort of split it up and separate it every so often, every couple of paragraphs, as a reminder to yourself to stop and think about what you're reading. We also talked in the last video about previewing the questions first and making a list from those questions of things to look for as you read, that look for list. So if you plan on doing either of those things today while you read this passage, go ahead and pause the video now and go ahead and get that taken care of. All right, the skill that we're going to talk about today is one that you've probably already heard before. Hopefully at some point in the past, a teacher has asked you to do this or showed you how to do this. One thing that a teacher has probably told you before is that it's important as you're reading a text on a test like this to mark the text. It's your copy, it's your test booklet, so you can highlight, you can draw things in the margin, you can underline, you can circle, you can do all of those things as you're reading. And a lot of teachers have probably told you you should or you have to. And for good reason. It's a really good thing to do. A, it can help you make sure that your brain is staying active and keep you engaged and focused on what you're reading. And B, the marks that you make can be really helpful when it comes to answering the questions, because you can mark things ahead of time that'll be helpful in helping you go back and find the information you're going to need. But all too often what we see is kids mark the text, but they don't really have a good system for how they're doing it. They just kind of mark whatever they want to mark and whatever they feel like marking at that moment. And so what happens is you end up with like one passage where you marked one or two things, and then another passage where you highlighted like 90% of the words. And you don't really know why you're doing it or what you're doing, and for a while you might be like, oh, I'm going to circle all the things that I don't understand. And in this paragraph, I'm going to highlight this because this kind of seems important. But now in this paragraph, I'm going to highlight this thing because I think it's funny. And all of a sudden, you've got all these random marks on your paper, and you don't really know what they mean, you don't really know why they're there, and they don't really help you. Not only are you ending up with all these marks that aren't very helpful, you've also wasted time and energy making them. So it's really important when you do mark the text that you do it in a way that has sort of a plan behind it and that is systematic, that you're always doing the same things every time and always marking the text in the same way. So when you think about coming up with a plan for this, there's two things you've got to keep in mind. You've got to think about what are you going to mark and how are you going to mark it. So when it comes to what you're going to mark, there's a couple of different options. And this is all just giving you all of the different options that are available. You don't have to do all of these. You can do one of them, you can do all of them. Some people choose to mark important information. So when they come across information that they think is important, like a character's name or a date, they might decide that they're going to mark that. Sometimes they like to mark the answers to questions. So if they're using that look for list and they find a word or a phrase that's going to help them answer the question, they like to mark those things. And some people like to mark their own personal reactions. They like to write themselves little notes in the margin. They like to sort of underline things that are confusing or mark things that they think are funny, whatever it might be. All of those are valid things to mark. You have to decide for yourself what's going to be the best use of your time. The other thing that you have to decide is how you're going to mark it. There's lots of different options. You can use your pencil for a lot of different things. You can underline, you can draw little symbols like arrows and stars and question marks. You can write notes to yourself out in the margin. And usually on the EOG, you also get a highlighter. So you can use that highlighter to underline. You can use the highlighter to circle and to do all of those things as well. So you have to come up, though, with something that's going to make sense to you. The best plan for this is going to be something that you understand and that's really personalized for the way you read and the way you think about what you're reading. The only bad plan is to do nothing. Honestly, if you get through a text and you don't make any notes on the paper, you're probably not going to do as well as you could. Even the best reader who does really well on standardized tests can still benefit from making 1 or 2 marks somewhere in the text. But what those marks are might vary depending on who's doing the reading. So you have to decide what's going to work best for you. So before you come up with your own plan, let me show you a couple of things that kids have done in the past. Keep in mind, these are just examples. You don't have to do the things that they're doing. These are just to give you some ideas of how other students have done it. So this is one of my girls' plans from last year. She decided that anytime she found an answer to a question, like if she was looking at her look for list, she would underline it. So from now on, anytime she wanted to find those answers, she knew to go back and search for the things that were underlined. She decided if she had some sort of a personal reaction, like she wanted to remember something, or she thought something was funny, or she had a connection, she would circle it. So she knew her circles always meant that she was having some kind of a reaction. She decided a question mark would always mean that something was confusing, and a star would always mean that something was important. She also told me that for her, it was really, really helpful for her to write notes out in the margin to actually put things down in her own words, because the act of putting it in her own words and writing it down really helped her remember and process that information differently. One of my guys last year had this plan. He decided that the only thing he was going to mark, the only time he was going to make a mark in the text, was to look for the things on his look for list. If it was an important piece of information that was going to help him answer a question, he was going to mark it. If it didn't fit that criteria, he wasn't going to do it. So he didn't mark anything he thought was funny. He didn't mark anything that was confusing, any of that kind of stuff. And so for him, he decided it was better for that to just be in his head, because he said, when I've got all those marks on the paper, it just gets really busy and really confusing, and I get lost about what I'm doing. So for him, if I were to take his paper and put it right next to the one that I showed you earlier, the girl who was doing a lot of different types of marks, they would look a little bit different. His would look a little bit more clean and simple, but it works for him because he was only choosing to mark the things that were more important. For him, it was more important for him to save that time and energy and only mark the things that were important. For the girl that I showed you earlier, it was more important for her to make those marks because it was helping her understand the text better. Another one that my kids came up with, and this one's actually been a few years ago, and I had a lot of kids use this last year. They really, really liked this one, was to use your pencil and your highlighter in 2 different ways. You get a pencil on the test to bubble in your answer sheet, but then you also get a highlighter. And so those are 2 really easy things to use because they look different on the page. When you look at a page that has pencil and highlighter on it, you can very easily let your eyes go to one or the other. So they decided that they were going to use, anytime they just had their own ideas, stuff that was confusing, stuff that was a connection, notes they wanted to make, they would use their pencil. They would underline, they would star, they would circle, whatever was appropriate. But if it was just their own ideas, they used a pencil. But when they found specific information, then the answers to the questions, when they were doing like the look for list, they used their highlighters. And again, with a highlighter, you can underline, you can highlight, you can star, all of that kind of stuff. So they knew when they went back to the text, if they were looking for information for a question, all they had to do was sort of skim through the stuff that was highlighted. They knew they could ignore all those pencil markings. But if they were looking to understand something better, they knew to go back to those pencil markings and see what was going on in their brain as they were working. Okay? So at this point, you kind of have to decide what's going to work best for you. The only bad plan is to do nothing. You can take one of the 3 examples I just showed you. If one of those really speaks to you and it makes total sense to you and you just want to make that your plan, sure, go for it. If you want to come up with your own plan that's a little bit different, that is perfectly fine. The things I just showed you were just examples, so you do not have to do any of those. Okay? So in your notes, there is a space at the bottom. There's a little box for you to fill in what your plan is going to be for marking the text. Take a second, pause the video, decide what your plan is going to be, and write it down. Okay, so while you're reading the passage today from Marbles to Machines, your job is to use whatever plan you just came up with. If you said you're going to circle things that are confusing, you should be circling things that are confusing. If you said you're going to be highlighting the answers to the questions, I should see highlighting on your paper that has the answers to the questions, right? We said in the last videos too, the only thing you have to do is show us that you know how to do this. If today, after you've used this plan, you realize you need to tweak it or change it or do something a little bit different, that's fine. But for today, you need to give an honest effort and show that you know how to mark the text in a good, systematic way. Okay, so as you're reading today, make sure that you are stopping periodically to review what you've read. Make sure that if you decided to use a look for list, you're marking the information that you found as you read, and make sure whatever plan you just chose, you're also making sure that you're marking the text with that plan. When you finish reading the text, you're also responsible for answering the questions. Good luck and have fun.